For hundreds of years, local legends spoke of a town beneath the sand dunes of South Wales. Fishermen told stories of church bells tolling under Kenfig Pool when storms approached. Treasure hunters searched the dunes for medieval silver. Historians pored over charters describing a prosperous 13th century borough that somehow vanished. But in 1989, the Kenfig Society transformed legend into archaeology. Their excavations revealed not myth, but material reality, a medieval town preserved beneath the dunes in such detail that archaeologists could walk its streets, measure its buildings, reconstruct its economy and social structure. The evidence triggered a fundamental reconsideration, because legends of drowned towns and magical disappearances obscured a more profound truth. Kenfig didn't vanish in a single catastrophic event. It died slowly, over 2 centuries, as environmental change made urban life progressively more difficult until finally impossible. What the archaeology revealed was a community fighting for survival against forces beyond their control. The question wasn't how Kenfig disappeared. The question was how it endured so long against such overwhelming odds. The ruins of Kenfig Castle rose from the sand dunes like a stone sentinel, marking the northern edge of what had once been one of South Wales's most important Norman settlements. Only the top of the 14-meter square keep remained visible, its dressed stone buttresses barely protruding above the shifting landscape. Everything else, the bailey, the defensive ditches, the town that had grown in its shadow, lay buried beneath depths varying from mere centimeters to 30 meters of sand. Kenfig's story began around 1147, when Robert, Earl of Gloucester, established a Norman stronghold on the frontier between English-controlled Glamorgan and the Welsh Highlands. The castle occupied a strategic position on a low mound, with the river serving as a natural moat to the west and north. A massive ditch protected the other approaches. By 1183, a chartered borough had developed to the south of the castle, granted privileges that made it one of the most important commercial centers in the region. The town that emerged was remarkable for its time. Charter records from 1360 documented a community with the rights to hold fairs and markets, to make their own bylaws, to regulate trade and commerce. Ordinances governed everything from the width of streets to the quality of beer sold in taverns. One regulation specifically prohibited butchers from throwing heads, feet, or other refuse into the high street or anywhere else that might annoy their neighbors. The Kenfig Society formed in 1989 with a single purpose: to unearth the secrets of their buried town. For more than 20 years, local volunteers had been systematically excavating small portions of the site, working weekends and holidays to reveal what lay beneath the dunes. By 2012, they had recovered more than 6,000 pieces of pottery, numerous coins including a voided long cross penny from 1247, Roman buckles, and medieval tools. Terry, a longtime member of the society, had spent years mapping the archaeological signatures across the dune field. The society's excavations had revealed tantalizing glimpses: medieval plowing ridges preserved in the subsoil, building foundations constructed from clay and stone, layers of charcoal suggesting repeated fires. When Francis Pryor arrived as archaeological director for Time Team's investigation, he faced a challenge unlike any he had encountered in 40 years of digging. Pryor was a specialist in waterlogged sites, places like Flagfen, where peat and silt had preserved Bronze Age timbers for thousands of years. But sand presented different problems entirely. "I felt very daunted," Pryor later wrote. "For most time teams, I normally just say yes, but in this case, I took a few days to make up my mind." The sand was lethal to work in. Unlike stable chalk or clay, it offered no warning before collapse. Dig a trench too deep, and the walls could trap an archaeologist, gradually compressing their ribs until they couldn't breathe. But Pryor's wife reminded him of a crucial fact. Nearly all his sites had been buried sites. The methodology remained the same. First, establish the old land surface, the OLS. Everything else would follow from that baseline. The investigation began with geophysics. John Gator, Time Team's geophysics specialist, deployed magnetometry equipment across the dune field, hoping to detect underground structures through variations in the magnetic field. The sand presented obvious challenges. Resistance surveys were useless in such loose, dry material. But magnetometry offered hope. If buildings really existed beneath the dunes, their stone foundations and debris should create detectable anomalies. The results exceeded all expectations. 2 clear lines of magnetic anomalies emerged from the data, running in perpendicular directions toward the castle. These weren't random variations. They were buildings, aligned along streets in a regular grid pattern. The medieval town's layout suddenly became visible for the first time in 5 centuries. What's particularly exciting, Gator explained, studying the printouts, is we appear to have two lines of what I can only see as buildings. And the roads, there's the gap between them. Follow the line straight into the castle. That has to be an east-west axis. The survey revealed something else. The settlement appeared concentrated within a defined area bounded by what might be the town's defensive perimeter. Francis Pryor called it the Bailey, an extended courtyard of the castle, protected by earthwork defenses. Phil Harding, Time Team's excavation specialist, opened the first trench across the massive earthwork that ringed the southern edge of the site. The goal was simple but crucial. Determine whether this was merely the castle's outer defenses or something larger, a fortified perimeter protecting an entire urban settlement. The excavation revealed a construction sequence that told a story of escalating threat. At the base of the section, beneath the defensive bank, lay a layer of intense burning charcoal, ash, and fire-damaged debris. Above it, the builders had raised a massive earthen rampart, compacting layers of clay and gravel into a formidable barrier. Perhaps that burning is an event in history, Harding suggested, examining the charcoal layer. An attack on the castle, and as a result, they strengthened or built for the first time this massive bank. The finds from the defensive trench provided crucial dating evidence. Deep within the rampart, embedded in the construction fill, archaeologists recovered a silver penny. Not just any coin, a voided long cross penny, a type minted for only a brief period in the mid-13th century. Dr. Robinson, the finds specialist, examined the coin under magnification. The voided long cross sits very comfortably between short cross pennies, which have a very short cross, and long cross pennies, where the cross goes from rim to rim. You can see on this one there are actually 3 lines that define the cross, 2 silver and 1 black, the void. They're very tightly datable. This one is from 1247. The coin's presence in the rampart meant the defenses were constructed or significantly rebuilt after 1247. Historical records confirmed what the archaeology suggested. Kinfig had been attacked and burned in the 1230s. The inhabitants responded by building these massive fortifications. The second trench targeted what geophysics had identified as the main east-west road. Raxa Maresh led the excavation, carefully removing the sand overburden to expose what lay beneath. At approximately 2 meters depth, the diggers encountered a hard, continuous surface, the medieval road itself. The preservation was extraordinary. Individual cobblestones remained locked in their original positions, laid with such care and precision that the surface showed no sign of the deep ruts and potholes that typically characterized medieval streets. "This is beautifully laid out," Pryor observed, kneeling to examine the stonework. "If there were deep holes and potholes and that sort of thing, we'd have revealed them archaeologically. They must have kept it regularly maintained." The ordinances of Kinfig confirmed what the archaeology revealed. A regulation from 1360 stated explicitly, "It is ordained that every burgess's tenant and resident dwelling within the town walls, where the pavements or causeways have been, shall and do keep them clean from dung and other filth upon pain of 12 pence at every wall." Fault. 12 pence represented a substantial fine equivalent to several days' wages for a skilled craftsman. The town's authorities took street maintenance seriously. This wasn't the muddy, rutted medieval thoroughfare of popular imagination. This was infrastructure maintained to commercial standards. Adjacent to the road, excavators uncovered the foundations of a substantial building. Stone walls, more than a meter thick, suggested a structure of considerable importance. The exterior face showed careful masonry work, dressed stones fitted together with clay mortar, the facade built to impress. Cassie, examining the building's remains, noted the high-status architectural details. "We're getting roofing slayed out, and lovely pieces of pen and sandstone with holes through for nails. And these ridge tiles, they're fired tiles glazed with green. They'd have provided a really decorative finish on the top. This is quite a smart building." The structure's location, immediately adjacent to the main road and close to the castle entrance, suggested it served an administrative or commercial function. This was the upmarket end of medieval Kinfig, where town officials conducted business and wealthy merchants maintained their premises. The finds from this building reinforced its high-status character. Among the debris, archaeologists recovered a decorative buckle, its copper alloy frame showing traces of silvering or tinning to mimic expensive silver. The style dated to 1350 through 1400 London fashion that had traveled west to Wales, adopted by Kinfig's prosperous merchant class. "This is quite a nice little find," the conservator explained. Looking at the actual frame itself, in this corner it looks a little bit silvery. That's either copper alloy that's been tinned or silvered to make it look like silver, or it may well actually be silver. I've managed to date this quite securely from examples found in London excavations. Following the geophysical survey results, a third trench targeted the intersection where the north-south road should meet the east-west thoroughfare. The excavation revealed not just a road junction, but evidence of the town's spatial organization. The north-south route ran from the castle toward the defensive perimeter. Along its length, building foundations appeared at regular intervals, suggesting planned development burgage plots laid out according to a coherent urban design rather than organic, haphazard growth. Behind the primary streets, smaller structures revealed a different side of Kenfig's social geography. Matt Williams excavated a building that appeared to have been terraced into the natural slope, its walls constructed from rougher stonework, its floor simply compacted earth rather than paved stone. Even more revealing was what happened to this space over time. The building fell into disuse, and the area behind the defensive rampart became a municipal dump. Residents discarded broken pottery, animal bones, shells, food waste, the everyday refuse of medieval life accumulating in thick, dark layers. "I think it's absolutely what I wanted," one archaeologist noted. "Because we're just outside the settlement area, and you tend to put light industry away from your housing, both today and in the Middle Ages. That confirms that this outer area didn't have a lot of houses." Then, in a move that spoke to increasing pressure on urban space, someone built a workshop directly on top of the dump. Stone walls rose from the compacted garbage, creating usable floor space in an area previously considered marginal. "What I think it might mean," Phil Harding suggested, "is that the space within the bailey was getting really quite restricted. They were having to cram buildings in just to get them in." This wasn't typical medieval urban expansion. Towns usually grew outward, developing suburbs beyond their walls. Kenfig was building inward, intensifying land use within its protected perimeter. The question loomed: where were Kenfig's suburbs? Historical documents described a borough of 144 burgages, far more properties than could fit within the excavated defensive circuit. The town must have extended beyond the walls. Francis Pryor authorized trenches outside the perimeter, targeting areas where geophysics hinted at possible structures. What they found challenged expectations. Instead of residential buildings, the excavators uncovered evidence of industrial activity. A cobbled surface, heavily stained with charcoal and showing signs of intense heat. Metalworking debris scattered across the area. This was a forge or smithy, positioned deliberately outside the residential zone. "There's far too much charcoal here for it to be a hearth or something like that," the excavator explained. "You've got a good, decent cobbled surface. It smells pretty terrible down here. There's a lot of burnt stuff. Iron smelting, something like that." The placement made perfect sense. Medieval towns regularly zoned noxious industries, smithing, tanning, butchering away from residential areas. But the absence of houses suggested something unexpected about Kenfig's urban geography. Terry from the Kenfig Society confirmed the pattern from earlier digs. "The building itself, we don't think it was a house. It must have been a barn or an agricultural building. Around it were what looked to us like medieval plowing furrows. We felt we were definitely out of town, as it were. Open fields where the suburbs should have been. Industrial workshops where residential neighborhoods were expected." The archaeological evidence pointed to a stark conclusion. Kenfig's population chose to live within the defensive perimeter, even as space became critically constrained. The documents explained why. Kenfig suffered badly from raids by dispossessed Welsh lords, particularly Morgan Gam and the Princes of Affon. Historical accounts recorded attack after attack, burning after burning. In 1167, Welsh forces burned the town. They returned in 1183. The Great Llewellyn attacked, leaving the place in ruins. Later, Owain Glyndwr's forces destroyed it again. One vivid account from 1232 described how the townspeople, knowing Welsh forces approached, sent their cattle away for safety and actually burned some buildings inside the walls themselves, a scorched earth tactic designed to deny the enemy resources and create clear fields of fire. The archaeology confirmed the documentary evidence. In trench after trench, excavators encountered layers of charcoal and ash evidence of buildings burned, sometimes repeatedly. Tracy examined one particularly thick deposit of burning in the residential area. "You do wonder whether this might have something to do with conflict," she observed. "We're in the right place for it, given how many times they were attacked." But the inhabitants always rebuilt. Each destruction was followed by new construction. The sequence of buildings, one on top of another, told a story of remarkable resilience. As the excavation progressed, Francis Pryor and John Gator expanded the geophysical survey, attempting to map the full extent of Kenfig's medieval settlement. The results revealed a town that was simultaneously larger and more compact than anyone expected. Within the defensive circuit, an area roughly 200 meters on each side, the geophysics showed dense urban development. Buildings lined the streets in regular patterns. The infrastructure suggested careful planning, not organic medieval sprawl. But beyond those defenses, the magnetic anomalies faded. Where documents suggested suburbs should exist, the geophysics detected only agricultural features, field boundaries, plowing furrows, isolated outbuildings. Dr. Ralph Griffiths, medieval historian at Swansea University, examined the puzzle. The Charter of 1360 is really important. It confirms Kenfig exists as a town, which implies all sorts of rights to hold fairs and markets, to make ordinances governing daily life. These are laws that governed ordinary people's everyday lives. He read from one particularly evocative ordinance. It is ordained that no butchers shall cast no head's feet, nor none other garbage in the high street, nor in no other place to the annoyance of his neighbor. The regulations painted a picture of a sophisticated urban community with high expectations for public health and civic order. You can almost smell the medieval town coming out of these documents, Griffiths noted. To understand Kenfig's unusual geography, the team examined comparable sites. Kidwelly, a Norman plantation town in West Wales, showed a similar pattern. Dense development within an extended castle bailey, with limited suburban growth beyond defensive perimeters. What you see here is an implantation with a fairly regular grid pattern within the extended bailey of a castle, Griffiths explained. It's worth reminding ourselves that this is hostile territory from the Anglo-Norman perspective. The Welsh and the Highlands are coming down regularly. Implantation in a bailey makes a lot of sense. But you also get suburban overspill at Kidwelly, he continued. Much less predictable suburban expansion. The borough, instead of being a fixed entity, is actually quite mobile and fluid. We should anticipate settlement types popping up all over the area around Kenfig. The excavations outside the town walls revealed those suburban patterns with extraordinary clarity. Beneath the sand, preserved in the clay subsoil, ran a series of parallel ridges spaced approximately 18 inches apart. Medieval plowing furrows, created when farmers cultivated these fields in the 14th century. The consensus of opinion is that these represent the remains of furrows made by medieval farmers, Terry explained. In one particular year, these plowed fields would have been suddenly covered by sand and abandoned. Perhaps later the sand would be blown away, taking much of the topsoil with it. This process may have been repeated several times over the years, until all that was left are these marks in the subsoil. The furrows ran right up to building foundations, demonstrating that structures were built on what had recently been agricultural land. The pattern suggested a community adapting to sand encroachment, retreating, regrouping, trying to maintain agricultural production, even as the environment became increasingly hostile. By the 16th century, the battle was lost. John Leland, traveling through Wales around 1539, recorded what he saw. There is a little village on the east side of Kenfig, and a castle, both in ruin and almost choked and devoured with the sandies that the Severn Sather castieth up. Choked and devoured by sand. The phrase captured the catastrophe's nature. This wasn't instantaneous burial like Pompeii. This was slow strangulation, a century-long process during which the sea's sand gradually made life impossible. Dr. Sarah Coles, environmental archaeologist at Cardiff University, explained the mechanism. What we're looking at here is a perfect storm of environmental factors. The medieval warm period brought higher temperatures to Britain from roughly 900 through 1300 AD. That sounds beneficial, but it had complex effects on coastal environments. Higher temperatures meant more intense storm systems crossing the Atlantic. Increased rainfall in the uplands led to greater river discharge, altering sediment dynamics along the coast. Meanwhile, intensive cattle grazing in the Kenfig area, archaeologically documented by the cattle prints preserved beneath building foundations, removed stabilizing vegetation from the dunes. The sand was always there, Coles continued. What changed was its mobility. Without vegetation to anchor it, powerful storms could pick up massive volumes of sand and deposit them inland, not in one catastrophic event, but in repeated episodes across multiple generations. Geomorphological evidence supported this interpretation. Cores taken through the dune system revealed a complex stratigraphy. Layers of wind-blown sand alternated with buried soils. Periods when vegetation temporarily stabilized the dunes before the next storm episode triggered renewed sand movement. Radiocarbon dates from these buried soils bracketed the main sand incursion between 1300 and 1470. The process took nearly 2 centuries, during which Kenfig's inhabitants fought a losing battle against environmental change. Kenfig wasn't unique. Along Britain's western coasts, other medieval settlements suffered similar fates. At Broughton Burrows in Devon, at Newborough Warren in Anglesey, at Colburn Sands in Scotland, medieval communities confronted advancing dunes, Most abandoned their sites completely, relocating inland. What made Kenfig remarkable was the community's determination to remain. Even as sand filled their streets and buried their fields, they stayed, rebuilding, adapting, intensifying land use within shrinking perimeters. The same storms that buried the town created Kenfig Pool, the largest natural freshwater lake in Glamorgan. Medieval records from Margam Abbey described it as a fishery connected to the sea by a channel or gutter. By the 16th century, the pool covered 70 to 80 acres, fed by springs and trapped behind the encircling ridge of sand dunes. The pool became the focus of local legends, stories of drowned towns, of church bells tolling beneath the waters, of divine retribution for human wickedness. These legends confused the real sand-buried town with mythical underwater settlements, blending fact and folklore. The documentary record tracked Kenfig's decline with bureaucratic precision. Port Reeve records, accounts of the town's chief administrative officer, showed steady tax revenues through the 13th century. The town contributed to parliamentary representation along with other Glamorgan boroughs. But 14th century assessments told a different story. Properties listed as productive in 1300 were recorded as waste by 1350. The number of burgage plots paying taxes declined year by year. By 1420, only a fraction of the original 144 plots remained occupied. The final records, from the late 15th century, described a town in its death throes. Between 1471 and 1485, the parish church of Street, James was dismantled stone by stone and rebuilt in Pyle, a settlement further inland. Using materials salvaged from the old church, the new community established itself along the highway between Modlam Church and Newinnie, beyond the sand's reach. To understand how Kenfig's buildings were constructed and how they burned, Alex Langlands and Matt Williams conducted experimental archaeology. They built a small structure using medieval materials and techniques, then tested how vulnerable it would be to fire arrows, a common siege weapon in Welsh attacks. The experiment revealed that starting fires wasn't as simple as Hollywood suggested. Fire arrows required preparation. The arrowhead needed to be wrapped in linen cloth soaked in accelerant. Even then, hitting a thatch roof didn't guarantee ignition. The arrow might smolder for hours before catching. What you've got to remember is while I'm going in there with a fire arrow and running back, all my mates are behind me shooting at the defenders, Matt explained, demonstrating medieval siege tactics. A whole country full of people shooting at you. When they finally managed to ignite their straw test structure, it burned intensely. The experiment demonstrated that once a fire took hold in a medieval town, it would spread rapidly. Thatch roofs, timber framing, wooden furnishings, everything was fuel. At the end of the day, it's not quite how it looks in the movies, Alex concluded, watching the flames. But perhaps it wasn't as easy to burn Kenfig as we think. The real question is why we find so much burning in the archaeological record. Multiple episodes suggest these weren't all accidental fires. These were attacks. The defensive bank revealed no trace of stone walls. Instead, the archaeology suggested a timber palisade, a strong wooden fence, or stockade crowning the earthwork. Post holes and stake holes appeared along the bank's crest, spaced at regular intervals. Your story that there was perhaps a wooden palisade is very plausible, Phil Harding confirmed, examining the evidence. We do have burning in the layers here. We can say there were fires. But what's really interesting is the sequence. It looks like we've probably got a palisade defense that gets burned. Then they build this massive bank. The timber defenses had advantages: quick to construct, relatively inexpensive, easily repaired. But they had one critical vulnerability: fire. Historical records mention that Kenfig's palisade was struck by lightning and burned. Whether by lightning, siege fire, or accident, wooden defenses were always at risk. The pottery recovered from Kenfig provided a detailed chronology of occupation. Early materials dated to the 12th century simple cooking pots and storage jars from the town's founding period. By the 13th century, the assemblage showed increasing sophistication. Glazed jugs, decorative vessels, imported wares from Bristol and further afield. The pottery from the 14th and 15th centuries told a different story. Lower quantities, less variety, more emphasis on utilitarian wares, the archaeological signature of a community under stress, cutting back on luxury goods, focusing on essentials. We found something like 6,000 pieces of pottery, Terry from the Kenfig Society noted. That might sound like a lot, but it's from excavations spanning more than 20 years. When you compare it to what you'd expect from a thriving medieval town of this size over 3 centuries, it's actually quite modest. It suggests significant periods when parts of the town were abandoned or very lightly occupied. One building excavated by the Kenfig Society revealed a construction technique rarely preserved in the archaeological record. The structure had walls built from clay, a method known as clom construction, where clay was packed between timber frames to create standing walls. Normally, the clay in the walls would have been washed away over the years, Terry explained. But in our case, it was protected by sand. This must be one of the oldest buildings of this type in existence. The building lacked post holes to support a roof, leading archaeologists to conclude that the structure used timber crux, curved wooden frames that sprang from flat stones at the building's base and arched overhead to support the thatch. The technique was elegant, economical, and completely dependent on skilled carpentry. Standing on the excavated east-west road, Francis Pryor marveled at what the sand had preserved. I can't remember a time team where we've had such an opportunity to see a really well-preserved medieval road. This is beautifully laid out. If there were deep holes and potholes, we'd have revealed them archaeologically. This completely demolishes our idea that medieval roads were rutted and full of mud and stuff chucked from first-floor windows. The road extended for dozens of meters, its surface intact, cobbles still locked in their original positions. Drainage considerations were evident, the road crowned slightly in the center, allowing water to run off into side channels. This wasn't infrastructure casually maintained. This was engineering sustained over generations through regulation, taxation, and community commitment to urban standards. The administrative building near the castle, excavation revealed not just foundations, but wall elevations standing to significant heights. The sand had supported the masonry as it collapsed, preventing the stone from scattering or being robbed for later construction. The exterior walls showed three distinct construction phases. An initial structure, built around 1200, was enlarged in the 13th century, then partially rebuilt after what appeared to be fire damage. Each phase used slightly different masonry techniques, reflecting changing building practices and perhaps different craftsmen. This is completely unexpected, Cassie observed. We've got a wall standing to maybe 6 or 8 courses high. It's proper masonry, really nicely bonded, with a good face on this side. You couldn't have asked for a better wall. And look, we're just back from the castle entrance. This has to be the upmarket end of town. Unlike many archaeological sites where organic materials decay completely, Kenfig's sand burial created zones of exceptional preservation. Where the sand remained dry, wooden objects survived through desiccation. Where groundwater saturated the sand, waterlogged conditions preserved organic remains. Excavators recovered wooden tool handles, leather shoe fragments, textile scraps, materials that would normally vanish from the archaeological record. The preservation wasn't as complete as at waterlogged sites like Flagfen, but it far exceeded what anyone expected from a sand-buried context. The sand has done a fantastic job, Pryor noted. Not as good as peat or silt for preserving wood, but much better than we usually get from dry sites. And for everything else, pottery, stone, metal, the preservation is superb. The artifacts are coming out almost as if they were deposited yesterday. Combining the geophysical survey with excavation results, the team reconstructed Kenfig's medieval layout. The castle occupied the northwestern corner. The main east-west road ran from the castle entrance toward the eastern gate. A north-south road intersected it, creating the town's primary crossroad. High-status buildings clustered near the castle and along the main roads. Behind them, residential structures filled the burgage plots, long, narrow properties typical of medieval planned towns. At the back of these plots, excavators found evidence of gardens, workshops, storage pits, and refuse dumps. The defensive perimeter enclosed approximately 4 hectares. Within that space, the town supported perhaps 500 to 800 inhabitants, a substantial urban population for medieval Wales. Dr. Griffiths calculated population from the burgage data. 144 burgages in the mid-14th century. If we assume an average household size of 5 to 6 people per burgage, that gives us 700 to 900 inhabitants. Add in people living in smaller properties, servants, clergy, and you're probably looking at close to 1,000 people at Kenfig's peak. For comparison, nearby Neath had perhaps 1,500 inhabitants in the same period. Cardiff, the regional center, held 3,000 to 4,000. Kenfig ranked as a significant secondary town large enough to sustain specialized craftsmen, important enough to warrant parliamentary representation. The artifact assemblage revealed Kenfig's commercial connections. Imported pottery from Bristol, Exeter, and even France appeared throughout the occupation sequence. Metal artifacts included tools and hardware that required specialized manufacturing. Coins from multiple regions circulated through the town. The voided long cross penny from 1247 was joined by short cross pennies, long cross pennies, and 14th century issues. Each coin represented commercial transactions, wages paid, goods purchased. This wasn't a subsistence community, noted the finds specialist. This was a commercial borough integrated into regional and national trade networks. People here were buying and selling goods, paying for services, accumulating wealth. Archaeological evidence revealed clear social stratification. The administrative building with its carefully dressed masonry represented one extreme. At the other end, the rough structures terraced into the defensive bank showed where poorer residents made do with marginal space and basic construction. Between these extremes, most burgages held solid. Middle-class buildings, timber-frame structures with stone foundations, tiled roofs, whitewashed walls. These were the homes of merchants, craftsmen, and town officials who formed Kenfig's commercial backbone. The social geography was deliberate. High-status buildings faced the main streets where they could advertise their owners' wealth and importance. Working-class structures hid behind and above them, out of sight but still within the protected perimeter. The building sequence documented how Kenfig's inhabitants adapted as sand encroachment worsened. Early structures sat directly on the old land surface. Later buildings rose on platforms of compacted material, elevating their floors above the rising sand level. Some properties showed evidence of abandonment and reoccupation. Sand would fill a structure to the rafters, forcing residents to leave. Years later, wind would scour out the sand, and someone would rebuild in the same footprint, sometimes reusing the old foundations, sometimes building entirely new structures. This wasn't steady decline, Pryor observed. This was a fluctuating situation where the town's geography kept changing. Areas would become uninhabitable, then usable again, then buried again. The community kept adjusting, kept trying to make it work. The medieval plowing furrows documented agricultural collapse. In good years, farmers cultivated fields right up to the town walls. Then sand would inundate the fields, making them useless. Desperate for agricultural land, residents would build structures on what had recently been farmland. The cattle prints beneath building foundations showed the sequence clearly. Livestock grazed the area. Farmers plowed it. Sand covered it. The wind scoured the sand away. Someone built a structure. More sand came. The cycle repeated. Environmental stress forced difficult choices. Maintain expensive defenses and live in a cramped urban core, or expand beyond the walls and risk Welsh attacks. Kenfig chose containment, accepting diminishing space rather than abandoning the protection the Bailey provided. The latest archaeological materials dated to the mid to late 15th century. By this point, only a small community remained. Pottery from this period came from limited areas, suggesting occupation concentrated in the most defensible zones near the castle. Buildings from the final phase showed hasty construction and poor maintenance. Stone was reused from earlier structures. Wall foundations settled unevenly into sand. Repairs were made with whatever materials came to hand. The sense of a community in extremis permeated the archaeology. People were holding on, maintaining a presence, but the resources and population to sustain an urban settlement had largely evaporated. In 1471 and 1485, Kenfig's inhabitants made a definitive statement about their town's future. They dismantled the parish church of Street. James and rebuilt it, stone by stone, in Pyle, 3 kilometers inland. The church at Pyle still stands, its construction history visible in the fabric. The lowest courses use smaller stones material salvaged from Kenfig's buried church. Above them, larger stones show where medieval builders continued construction with newly quarried material. Moving a church wasn't undertaken lightly. In medieval theology, churches were consecrated ground, the literal house of God. Dismantling one admitted that the community it served had died. The new church at Pyle declared the Kenfig survivors had accepted reality and moved on. Remarkably, Kenfig maintained its legal identity even after physical abandonment. The borough continued contributing to parliamentary representation until the Reform Act of 1832 abolished rotten boroughs. For more than 300 years after the town died, Kenfig existed as a legal fiction, a chartered borough with essentially no population. The municipal ceremonial mace, symbol of the borough's authority, was preserved and eventually placed in the National Museum of Wales. A pewter copy remains at the Prince of Wales Inn, a 17th-century building that marked the edge of the new settlement. Francis Pryor conducted a final assessment of the site's archaeological significance. What we have here is genuinely comparable to Pompeii in terms of preservation quality. The mechanism was different centuries of gradual burial instead of sudden catastrophe. But the result is similar. A medieval urban landscape frozen in time, preserved under the overburden that buried it. The comparison extended to archaeological potential. At Pompeii, Excavators revealed not just buildings, but the contents of those buildings: furniture, tools, art, food, the full material culture of Roman urban life. At Kenfig, the same potential existed. We've barely scratched the surface, Pryor continued. The Kenfig Society has done 20-plus years of excavation, and they've investigated maybe 1% of the buried town. Under these dunes are complete houses with their contents, workshops with tools still in place, shops with their inventories. The preservation means we could learn more about medieval urban life from this one site than from dozens of conventional excavations. Why is preservation so exceptional? Dr. Coles, the environmental archaeologist, explained the specific conditions required. First, you need rapid burial to protect archaeological materials from scavenging and decomposition. The sand provided that. Second, you need the burial material to be essentially sterile, no organic activity to break down buried materials. Dry sand qualifies. Third, you need the site to remain undisturbed afterward. Kenfig was abandoned and never reoccupied. No medieval plow teams, no Georgian builders, no Victorian railway engineers disturbed the deposits. Finally, you needed the burial to be deep enough to discourage treasure hunters and casual artifact collectors. At depths up to 30 meters, Kenfig's archaeology remained largely inaccessible until modern excavation equipment and archaeological standards made systematic investigation possible. The Kenfig story offered profound lessons about climate change and human adaptation. The medieval warm period created environmental conditions that made coastal settlement increasingly precarious. Communities had to choose: adapt or relocate. Kenfig tried to adapt. Its inhabitants built defenses, raised building platforms, intensified land use, and maintained urban standards, even as their physical environment deteriorated. For 2 centuries, they succeeded in sustaining urban life under increasingly difficult circumstances. But ultimately, adaptation has limits. When agricultural land becomes unusable, when defensive perimeters shrink too far, when the physical environment changes beyond accommodation, communities must relocate or die. What's remarkable about Kenfig, Dr. Griffiths observed, isn't that it eventually failed. It's that it endured so long. These people were remarkably tenacious, remarkably committed to their town and its identity. They gave up only when literally every alternative had been exhausted. Kenfig boroughs form part of the Kenfig National Nature Reserve, managed by Bridgeon County Borough Council. The site is designated a Site of Special Scientific Interest, recognized for both its ecological and archaeological significance. The dunes support rare and endangered species, including high concentrations of fen orchid. Kenfig Pool provides habitat for waterfowl and rare aquatic plants. The reserve balances ecological conservation with archaeological protection and public access. A visitor center provides interpretation of the site's history. Walking paths cross the dune field, offering views of the castle ruins and the landscape that once supported a thriving medieval town. Information boards explain the archaeological evidence and the environmental processes that buried the settlement. After 3 days of intensive excavation, the time team crew assembled the evidence. Francis Pryor built a scale model using yogurt pots to represent buildings, large pots for high-status structures, small ones for ordinary houses. Here's the castle, Pryor explained, positioning the model. And there are 2 sizes of buildings. The big ones are where Cassie and Tracy were digging the high-status buildings. Then there's a main east-west road, and to the left, just behind the defensive bank, is the rough end of town where Phil worked. Then we've got another road heading out through the perimeter. And beyond that, open fields and farms. For about 300 years, that was the town of Kenfig. And then the winds got up, and the sands gathered, and slowly the whole thing was buried. The excavations confirmed what Francis Pryor had suspected from the beginning. Kenfig deserved comparison with Pompeii, not because of how it died, volcanic eruption versus gradual sand burial, but because of what survived. There is, of course, a big difference, Pryor wrote afterward. Pompeii was buried in minutes, whereas our southern Welsh medieval town took about a century to be engulfed. But the fact remains that both were preserved under hundreds of thousands of tons of overburden. Complete burial presents huge archaeological challenges, but also incredible opportunities. The archaeology revealed a medieval urban community at the height of its development. Well-maintained roads, substantial buildings, sophisticated infrastructure, economic prosperity, social complexity. Then environmental change triggered a long, slow decline that ended in total abandonment and burial. The excavations transformed understanding of medieval Welsh urbanization. Historical documents describe towns like Kenfig, but the physical reality often disappointed archaeologists. Most medieval Welsh towns left minimal archaeological traces, scattered building foundations, fragments of pottery, ambiguous features, difficult to interpret. Kenfig offered something unprecedented, a complete preserved medieval urban landscape. Streets in their original condition, buildings standing to significant heights, artifacts in situ, showing exactly where they were used and discarded. The full material culture of a 13th and 14th century borough. We got streets, we got houses, we got defensive works, we got evidence of industry and agriculture and commerce, prior summarized. We got the complete package, and it's all frozen at specific moments in time, sealed by the sand that buried it. You simply don't get that kind of preservation at normal medieval sites. Before Kenfig, medieval Welsh towns were understood primarily through documents and limited excavation. The conventional wisdom held that these were relatively simple settlements, smaller and less developed than their English counterparts, with basic infrastructure and modest material culture. Kenfig challenged that narrative. The road preservation demonstrated sophisticated urban planning and maintenance. The building architecture showed skilled craftsmanship and substantial investment. The artifact assemblage revealed commercial prosperity and international trade connections. This wasn't a primitive frontier settlement, Dr. Griffiths concluded. This was a fully developed medieval borough with urban standards comparable to anywhere in Britain. The fact that it was on the Welsh frontier, subject to attack and environmental stress, doesn't mean it was backward or unsophisticated. If anything, the challenges these people faced make their achievements more impressive. Despite Time Team's success, vast areas of Kenfig remain unexcavated. The Kenfig Society estimates that less than 5% of the buried town has been archaeologically investigated. The rest lies waiting beneath the dunes. Key questions remain unanswered. Where exactly was the marketplace? What happened to the castle's interior buildings? How did residential areas differ between wealthy and poor neighborhoods? What specialized industries operated in the town? The potential for future discoveries is extraordinary. Somewhere under these dunes are the church foundations, the guild hall, dozens of shops and workshops, hundreds of houses, Prior noted. Each one could tell us something new about medieval urban life. Each one could reveal artifacts, architecture, or information we've never seen before. The Kenfig excavations influenced medieval archaeology beyond Wales. The preservation quality demonstrated what sand burial could achieve, prompting archaeologists to reconsider other sand-buried sites they'd previously dismissed as too difficult or too degraded. The urban planning evidence challenged assumptions about medieval town development. Kenfig showed that 12th century borough foundations could involve sophisticated layout and infrastructure from the very beginning, not just organic growth that gradually acquired urban characteristics. The environmental evidence provided a case study in climate change and human adaptation. Kenfig demonstrated how medieval communities responded to long-term environmental deterioration, the strategies they employed, the choices they made, the limits they eventually encountered. Kenfig's legacy extended far beyond its medieval existence. The borough's legal identity persisted for centuries after its physical death. The landscape it occupied became one of Wales's most important nature reserves. The community it spawned relocated but maintained continuity. Modern Pyle and Kenfig Hill trace their origins directly to refugees from the buried town. The lessons resonated across time. Medieval Kenfig faced environmental change beyond its control. Its inhabitants responded with resilience, adaptability, and determined effort to preserve their community. They succeeded for generations before finally admitting defeat. That's not a story of failure, Dr. Griffiths argued. That's a story of remarkable human endurance in the face of overwhelming environmental pressure. These people gave everything they had to save their town. They only abandoned it when literally nothing more could be done. As excavation concluded, Francis Pryor delivered his final assessment. I've dug hundreds of archaeological sites over 40 years. I've found Bronze Age field systems, Neolithic ceremonial centers, Iron Age villages. But Kenfig is genuinely unique. This is Britain's best preserved medieval town, and we've only begun to understand what it can teach us. The sand that killed medieval Kenfig gave modern archaeology an incomparable gift, a complete urban settlement frozen in time, waiting to reveal its secrets to patient investigation. Time Team sends yet another myth to the recycling bin, Pryor concluded, surveying the excavations. Medieval towns weren't all muddy, decrepit places with terrible infrastructure. At least some of them, like Kenfig, were well-planned, well-maintained communities with urban standards that would impress us even today. The archaeology proves it, preserved under tons of sand that became its shroud and its salvation.